really learn from, even if you fail in terms of the grant application process initially, you really can learn from that process. And, you know, I really would encourage people to keep trying. And I'll give you some examples of that from my own career. So just some disclosures. I'll talk a bit about an application that was led by Oncomark a bit later under the SME instrument program. So I have a commercial interest in Oncomark, and I'm also an SAB member on Carrick Therapeutics. And in terms of my lab, we essentially operate a cooperative group lab structure where we have 4 PIs, Dr. Antoinette Perry, Maria Principe, and Dr. David Hughes, the Cancer Biology and Therapeutics Lab. And I suppose the idea that we've constructed this lab really to provide an opportunity where people can work across different cancer types, looking at a variety of different kind of contexts in terms of from tissue, blood to patient data, using a variety of different technology approaches. So it's a great training ground for PhD students and postdocs. Again, just before I get into the, I suppose, content of the talk, I just should indicate, you know, again, I was very fortunate to lead this particular program, Breast Predict, for 6 years, which was funded fully by the Irish Cancer Society. We received $7.5 million. And I think the key message from this was really the idea of developing a national network in the cancer research space. Again, one of the key goals there was to kind of interact and unite activities around translational, clinical, and population-based research across a variety of different areas, particularly, for example, in the area of diagnostics and therapeutics. And really, I suppose one of the kind of fringe benefits from participating in this program was that it gave rise to opportunities for new interactions to occur. I might come back to that a bit later. Again, just a summation of, I suppose, out of the program, we trained a lot of people, PhD students and postdocs. A lot of them have gone to, you know, fantastic research positions around the world. Some of the postdocs and fellows have gained academic posts within various different university settings or gone on to industry. So really, I suppose the core message of my talk is really, can I convert what we term failure, and probably failure is not a great word, but not getting there the first time, into a success? And I just want to kind of give you a couple of examples of that. Just to give you, I suppose, some context there, you know, I've had a lot of involvement in terms of the EU funding landscape, particularly as a Marie Curie fellow. As a Marie Curie fellow under FP5, I finished my PhD in the Beatson Laboratories in Glasgow, and then I had a couple of choices, either to go to the US to do a postdoc or to go to industry to do a Marie Curie postdoc, and I chose the latter. And that was kind of interesting, kind of insight into, I suppose, research within an industrial setting. I had the fortune of having a kind of Marie Curie post there, and as part of that, it had an inbuilt return phase back to the home country. So I kind of had a 1-year post in my back pocket when I was trying to come back to Ireland to set up my own lab. And I suppose the idea is that that gave me a taste for the kind of EU funding system. I also, quite early on in my kind of academic career, I made sure I participated in terms of EU grant evaluation. And that's something I would strongly recommend any of the people, particularly if they're more junior and more senior, to try and submit their profile, their expert profile on the EU grant system, and where possible, participate in grant evaluations, because really that's the best way to learn about what it takes to actually get a grant over the finish line. The other kind of key message, which I'm going to come back to later, is, you know, a lot of my focus on this presentation is maybe in the area of coordination and, you know, kind of stepwise approach to building that. But one of the easiest ways to participate in an EU grant, particularly a network-based program, is as a partner. And, you know, I strongly encourage people to participate if it's their first experience in terms of the EU grant system, is to try to participate as a partner. And it also provides not only useful money to carry out your research, but it builds up a network that you can then use down the line for your own initiative. So what I've indicated here are some of the programs which I've been involved with, either as a partner or as a coordinator. As a coordinator, indicated as an asterisk, across different areas of cancer. And I'm going to focus on 2 of those programs today. So again, I suppose I've gained a lot of experience, and, you know, so we've had a lot of successes in terms of grant applications, but behind that, there's a lot of hard work and, you know, lack of success. So again, it's important not just to talk about kind of the successful programs, is talk about ones where you've kind of learned from. And the other key point is building and availing of your network. It's critical for any EU program, but also for research in general. If you even look at the kind of the way that things have happened in the COVID arena, this kind of international collaboration kind of landscape, you know, the same is true in cancer research. You know, we have to avoid thinking of silos and, you know, your own specific institution. You need to think outside the box in terms of that international, national and international framework. So this is a program which I had the pleasure of leading called Rather, and I want to tell you a bit about how this came about. This program was funded under a specific kind of what's called a health collaborative project. It was quite a large program, €6 million. We originally got 5 years of funding, but we went to periods of extension, particularly to facilitate a clinical trial component within the program. And it involved 8 partners. We had 2 industry partners, Oncomark and Agendia, and then we had 6 academic partners. So what was the starting point, rather? So the starting point, again, was born out of failure. I had this idea of trying to do something in the breast cancer space. I had a few contacts at a European level that I had met. And the idea is there were certain opportunities. There was a forerunner to collaborative programs called STREPS. And then you may be more familiar with Marie Curie, Sklodowska-Curie, ITN's innovative training networks. These are like PhD training programs or postdoc training programs. So I put together 3 applications, 3 failures. To be honest, I can't even remember how close I got at that point. But one of the things I decided to do was there was an opportunity to, under the 6 framework program, there was a new scheme called the Industry Academia Partnership Program. And the idea was that I spun out some aspects. Again, a classic STREP and ITN earn the order of around €3 to €4 million. They're large scale programs. ITNs can be quite challenging to manage. I think Lorraine O'Driscoll's on the webinar. She coordinates one of these. The IAPs, they were smaller, just more discrete entities, more manageable, particularly for me as a kind of junior PI. So I think we had 5 partners. The budget wasn't great. It wasn't massive anyway. It was around 600,000 across those 5 partners. But it really provided an opportunity to kind of get the ball rolling. And so that was really the first catalyst as a coordinator. And so that program allowed me to interact with some key players, particularly a person I'll show in a minute, Professor René Bernards of the NKI. René has a very strong cancer researcher of international renown, but also he was involved in a company called Agendia, which was a key molecular diagnostics company in the breast cancer field. And I suppose we had a good experience in target breast. So there was an opportunity came under the 7 framework program, a specific call topic, which was called Predicting Individual Response and Resistance to Cancer Therapy. And the problem for that particular call was, I think it specifically called out cancers which have a poor prognosis. And again, if you look at breast cancer, you know, we know that there are certain subtypes of breast cancer which have good outcome, traditionally better outcome than other tumor types. But we know that there are certain subgroups of breast cancer which still are underserved by current treatment strategies. So we decided to focus on those poor prognosis subtypes and created an argument there. And the catalyst was really from a telephone conversation I had with René Bernards, where he had a grant that he submitted to, I think, his local equivalent of it was a Dutch Cancer Society. Unfortunately, he didn't get it. And he said, okay, look, I like the idea. Can we expand it out at a European level? So following that telephone conversation with René, we spun this out, was here. We spun it out into a program, which I'll show later. So what happened in terms of the application process? So in this particular program, it was a 2-stage proposal, which I quite like because you don't waste a lot of time. So you really like the idea. So it was quite a short program application, 8 pages. We submitted. We got an invitation to submit to stage 2, which is a lot of work, on the 12th of December. And we decided to have a face-to-face meeting, which I'm a big believer of. And obviously it's a bit challenging now in the current era. So we decided to meet in a kind of a neutral location or an easy accessible location. So Schiphol Airport, where everybody just flew in the morning, and we had a meeting and we trashed out, you know, who's going to do what. And we submitted under tight time frame a stage 2 proposal, which again, it's 10 times the size of the stage 1. And we kept fingers crossed, and we then got the invitation to negotiate in April. And we were given approximately 1 month to negotiate. So the program itself is, what I like about this particular program is that we were kind of bringing together different skills bases. So we had a particular focus on 2 relatively understudied subgroups of breast cancer. Now, triple negative breast cancer, a lot of people have studied, but it's underserved by certain treatment modalities. But another group of breast cancers, which is comparatively not well studied, is invasive lobular breast cancer. So via our collaborators in the Netherlands Cancer Institute and Cambridge University, they had access to tissue samples from patients from these subgroup, and we had long-term survival data. And the idea was we had particular people with expertise in either gene expression profiling, copy number analysis, kinase arrays, or mutation analysis. So we decided to kind of do a multi-pronged assessment of those tissue specimens to find new kinase targets which were enriched in those subgroups which are potentially druggable. And so it was ambitious in terms of its design, because we were hopefully going to come up with a novel kinase target or a small number that we could drug. We would have a preclinical validation phase. We would validate these on other tissue specimens. And then we would have an initial clinical trial phase where I suppose the milestone was the first enrollment of a patient into a clinical trial, all within 5 years. Now, the program actually, again, as I mentioned, we did actually manage to participate and get to that point of a clinical trial, but we had to extend it out to facilitate enrollment. So the program was, highly successful. We generated a lot of outputs, a lot of not only interesting papers, but also some novel product opportunities that the 2 companies were able to progress. So stimulated by that, I decided to apply again for an EU grant. And in this case, I was always interested in trying to look at the intersection between breast and prostate cancer. And so in collaboration with my colleague, Bill Watson, and other collaborators we had identified around Europe, we decided to look at kind of a program where we could actually look at tissue-based biomarkers in breast cancer, particularly looking at risk stratification biomarkers in terms of risk of recurrence, and in breast cancer. And then prostate cancer, we're looking at serum-based biomarkers. And so we submitted the proposal. Unfortunately, we got a score of 12.5 out of 15, and it's pretty clear that the minimum bar really at the moment in terms of scoring, we just recently got feedback from another grant where we got 14.5 out of 15, which wasn't funded. So traditionally, it's around the 14.5 to 15 out of 15 you really need to score for some of these programs. So again, we had scored high on excellence. The impact and implementation, we suffered a bit. So unhappy, we didn't get there. And I think it's instructive to kind of pick out the evaluation summary report comments, some of those. So they felt that the innovation potential of the proposal was insufficiently demonstrated. We also fell down in terms of the communication and outreach strategies. And also, this is an important part that some grants kind of forget, is risk assessment and contingency measures were insufficiently addressed. So now this is again an example of a failure again, where we didn't get it, and what can we kind of derive from that? So again, it's a good quote from here, that failure is not getting knocked down, it's not getting back up again. And so we had the opportunity. I took the kind of same concept, but went to the reverse. I went from a EU grant and decided to actually apply for a national fund, in this case an SFI-PI grant. And we also, as part of that PI grant, which I received funding for, it also inbuilt funding for a Catalyst Award to identify new opportunities. And that provided an opportunity to organize a workshop where I really assembled some of the key leaders in the breast and prostate cancer field, really to kind of map out specific opportunities. And one specific area that we identified, which was a pretty well studied problem of overtreatment of early stage breast cancer. We know that the vast majority of early stage breast cancers, particularly in the case of ER positive breast cancer, can be treated with hormone therapy alone, and surgery don't potentially require chemotherapy or stand to exhibit minimal benefit. And the idea is it's an important need for appropriate risk stratification tools. So we know that, if we can identify very clearly this over 2/3 of patients which have a low risk of recurrence, we potentially can spare them chemotherapy. So ultimately, there are a variety of tests out there in that space. For example, the most well-known of those tests would be Oncotype DX. But there are some specific issues with those types of tests, which I won't go into. And as part of the spin-out company, Oncomark, we in-licensed the technology that I co-developed with myself and Adrian Bracken in Trinity. We licensed in the technology, and the company really secured EU funding to progress the clinical validation of the OncoMaster assay. And so, in a sense, we were quite lucky at the time because a specific call was under the SME instrument program. So this is funding that goes directly to, say, for example, one company may have some outreach to other partners, but generally it's one company. And the specific call was really ideally mapped for us. We had a technology which was past proof of concept, but we needed to undergo analytical and clinical validation. So it was kind of written almost exactly for where we wanted it. And we had a good argument to avail of the funding. So I won't go into the detail, but essentially it was quite a tight time frame. We applied for funding for a 2-year program to complete analytical validation, clinical validation, and assay benchmarking of the technology. We also asked for funding for commercial development and also project management functions. So we put it in the first attempt. We went direct. We didn't bother with the phase 1. We went direct for phase 2, which is direct. I think it was around 2.5 million approximately we applied for. And we got a pretty high score, 87%. But again, as I mentioned, to get funding under this scheme, you need to be up in the high 90s. And so we had a couple of changes. We got a new CEO. The new CEO, his current CEO, Des O'Leary, he had a lot of experience in diagnostics. So that really helped us. We also had very useful feedback from our national contact point, particularly for companies. Sean Burke was a vast source of knowledge. And again, I would encourage people to avail of interaction with your specific national contact point, and I'll come back to that later. And again, Sean really was valuable because he really provided an objective viewpoint in terms of our proposal, and he kind of gave some guidance in terms of a simpler, more business-oriented description. And so we, in our second attempt, we actually did very well. We scored first out of 125 applicants. Only 3 were funded out of 125 applicants, and we got 2.7 million. So one of the things I want to kind of indicate, and again, this is obviously one of the key sections for a lot of EU grants is impact section. And I think it's important that you really address the impact as you would with the scientific excellence piece. You really need to define the impact at different levels. So for example, our technology, we were proposing would have an impact in terms of for oncologists to identify patients that could that may or may not need chemotherapy. We also had an impact on patients because maybe we could spare patients unnecessary treatment and side effects, and also maybe reduce costs. Again, the cost benefit aspect was important for hospitals and again also for government. So the idea is to kind of pick out your different stakeholders and then define the impacts in an evidence-based approach. Again, because this was a commercially orientated grant, and again, this is obviously I'm speaking from a single company viewpoint, but a lot of programs that you now bid for, network programs, they encourage SME participation. And again, one of the most recent programs we bidded for, where we got 14.5 out of 15, one of the criticisms was we didn't have enough company participation. So, you know, it was possible that we would have gotten funded if we had increased our company participation. So I won't labor the point, but ultimately for that more commercially relevant piece, even if you're writing from an academic viewpoint, you really need to describe also what's commercially interesting for those companies and kind of tease that out of that partner. So for example, it could be, you know, increased market uptake. It could be growth, lead to growth of the company, attract investment. So you need to describe that in a concrete manner. So I want to shift gears really now and talk a bit about, I suppose, kind of lessons learned. And again, this is just one person's kind of experiences. And, you know, I suppose, again, you can take it or leave it, but these are just some things I've learned over, you know, applying for these programs. Hopefully it will be of use. The first thing, as I mentioned, put your name forward and your expertise, if you've got specific expertise. And again, a very good word of wisdom from a colleague of mine, Annette Byrne. She is probably one of the most successful people in Ireland in terms of availing of EU grant funding. I think she coordinates at least 4 EU grants, and is to put forward your name as an expert evaluator, but also make sure when you put in the keywords which are relevant to your expertise that they're mapped to specific forthcoming calls. So when someone, for example, EU project manager, kind of is searching for people for expertise, your name comes up through the system. So it's a very good, clever idea. I think face-to-face meetings are essential, are critical, because really you need to see the kind of white of the person's eyes, the other corresponding partner. They need to vocalize what's in it for them. It's insufficient to really write a grant by pure email alone. Now you can do that to a certain degree by Zoom and other kind of online interfaces. But if we can kind of get back to a system where we can actually physically meet people, I think there's no better option than doing that. And I'm not sure if it still exists. But there was essentially Enterprise Ireland had an office in Brussels, which we availed of a couple of years back, and where you can actually meet people in a centralized location. I'm pretty sure that maybe is still there. I would encourage people to make sure you make contact at an early level with your relevant national contact point. So Kay Dublin Walls would be kind of key expert in the area of the kind of health space. Geraldine Canny and the Marie Curie, Skłodowska Curie. Martha Cahill, it would be on the more industry side. The other part I think is important is devising a well-functioning and complementary team. So it's critical that you kind of have not have too much redundancy in the system. You've got people, if you have a lot of people who look the same in terms of their profile, you're not really looking at additive value. So for example, if you've got 4 bioinformatics groups all doing the same thing, when as an evaluator, you don't really see the added value of the other 3 partners. So really you need to think about kind of like a strong interconnected team and well-functioning team. You could have people from the clinical background or non-clinical background, industry, academic sector. You may have people from a patient stakeholder forum, for example. It's also important to identify the target audience, and the target audience here is other scientists generally. And they also, if you think about a panel, so I've participated in multiple EU panels, and what you generally have are people who aren't really expert in that specific space. It depends on the call. If it's a Marie Curie call, it definitely is quite broader. Some of the collaborative health calls, they might be a bit more specialized, but generally you should assume that the person comes with a very much of a general background, obviously maybe in cancer, but very much general. And so therefore you have to actually write the proposal in that context. Don't assume that they know what you're talking about. You really have to kind of bring them into it. Also, you need to maintain a sense of enthusiasm about your proposal. If you're not excited about your proposal, the reviewer will not be excited. They also will not advocate for your proposal. So you need someone to, to almost act as a cheerleader for your proposal. So engender that excitement. It's critical that you avoid doublespeak. Ultimately, the challenge with a lot of EU grants, traditionally anyway, is that you may get some text from, your institution or other people, and it looks good from a management text, but it's all gobbledygook. It's kind of jargon, and it's not fit for purpose. You really need to avoid jargon wherever possible, and management doublespeak. You really need to make it very accurate across the board and be specific. Another piece of advice I would have is, particularly if you're talking about a kind of a consortium, is you need to agree up front who gets what, particularly if you've got several companies in the room or in the network. For example, if you've got 2 diagnostic companies which are in the same area, there's a potential natural conflict that you're going to find challenging in delivering that program. And also when you're writing the proposal, it kind of looks odd that you have 2 people in the same marketplace. So really, it's important that you kind of have that tough discussions and thrash out who gets what in the eventuality that the program is funded. Because there's nothing worse than actually getting something funded and then you're left with the mess. That is probably the most important slide for me as a person who's coordinated programs. I would not coordinate a program unless I had in my back pocket or someone behind me as a project manager. And I've had the pleasure of really having some really fantastic project managers kind of being linked in either in UCD or in Oncomark. One of the key people out there was Maureen Rafferty, particularly, who was probably one of the most green-fingered project managers. She worked with me in the early days in Oncomark and pretty much wrote pretty much all of the grants that Oncomark was participated in. Maureen is now a chief operations officer within a spin-out company, Deciphex, which also have a big track record in the EU and national grant funding space. Karen Mistier then came in into Oncomark to take over some of that activity, particularly running the SME instrument program. She's now the project manager for the Wellcome ICAP program. And again, we had two fantastic project managers, which also worked with Breast Predict, Fiona Lanigan and Claire, who spoke earlier. So again, project managers are key. And again, I suppose my strategy is traditionally I've used project managers which are embedded in my team, who come with a life science background, or generally they have a trained sense of science, they know how science functions. And then it makes it much easier for me to be able to kind of push forward on the agenda. The other part is because these are networks and you know, or generally they're networks, they're kind of constructions. You need a layered project management structure. And the classic structure really is you have work packages, leads, and deputies. I think it's also always important to have a deputy structure. If, for example, in my day, when I applied for the RADA program, I was still quite junior in my career, and I felt as if, oh, could I really be a coordinator for that program? And so my strategy at the time was really partner with Rene. He was internationally known. I think he had gotten his second ERC grant, advanced ERC grant at the time. And so my idea was I would be the administrative coordinator and Rene would be the scientific coordinator, because again, he's known in the field. And we had this effective partnership. And that really, I suppose, in a sense, gave me a leg up in terms of coordinating a big program. And then after that, obviously I had a track record then of leading a big program. It's also important that you need to tailor your approach. You really need to understand who you're getting into bed with in terms of your partners, about, you know, how you're going to actually work with these individuals. You need to really get to know those people. And also it's critical that if you have someone, for example, that's quite, you know, hesitant in terms of giving you information, even if they've won a Nobel Prize or they've, you know, they've got their second ERC grant or they've got 10 science papers in the last year, if they don't actually respond to you and if they don't give you the information that you need, don't use them, okay? Because they're going to be a hindrance. So it's critical that any partners that you bring in will contribute, because again, you have to actually, you know, you're limited by your weakest point. The other part I want to mention, once the program is, you know, once you're awarded the program, it's key that you keep tabs on the people who are actually not so much even the investigators, but the people on the ground. So, for example, this is a snapshot from the RADA working group on data integration. They came to Dublin for, I think, a week period where we're kind of trying to trash out how do we actually integrate this data, this complex network of data that we generated. And we just really felt we needed a physical meeting of all the bioinformatics members from the consortium. Another thing that's very important once the program is funded is effective communication with the project officer. Now, one of the challenges in that context is there has traditionally been a lot of turnover of project officers within programs. So I remember in one program I had, and in the space of a year, I think I had 5 project officers. And so it's hard to build up that relationship. But if you've got some people in that space, so for example, Jan Willem van der Loo, who's been in the kind of cancer space for many years, he would be a person that you could probably engage with on a long-term basis. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to finish off with just some general words of advice on the application, and we might kind of come across, you know, some of this might be also probed in the Q&A function. So some general words of advice in terms of the application. It's clear that you have a consistent message throughout the document. So really, you know, once you have all your inputs, someone, you know, preferably the coordinator with the project manager, they streamline it and make it into a one beast. An evidence-based approach should be used for all sections, not just science and technology. People complain about management and impact, but you should use the same approach for those sections as you do for science and technology, an evidence-based approach. For example, if you're talking about market, you should actually define the market. You should use a research-based approach where you actually define that in concrete terms. You should avoid simplification of text, while simplification of text is preferable, avoid generalizations. You need to be tangible, you need to be concrete. So for example, one of the strategies I have is if I'm talking about a new diagnostic that we're creating, I give it a name. I kind of make it real, even though it's probably 2 or 3 years down the line. I try to kind of make it more tangible. I find what's very useful, because I'm a visual person, is to get a central concept diagram in place. If you remember that diagram we had from Rather, we focused on that diagram and we built everything around that. So the work package structure flows from that. Also, each partner should clearly contribute to the program. You shouldn't have someone kind of falling off the edge or not really contributing, because that will be found out during the review process. And not only should they contribute, they should benefit. If someone doesn't benefit from the participation, they don't really get anything out from it, they'll just kind of disentangle themselves from the network. And also it will actually be seen by the evaluator. So one very useful tool to actually identify who's committed or not, I used to always ask people to fill out a 1 or 2 page form, which asked for a partner's contribution, asked what they can contribute and what they can benefit. And if someone can't provide that form, then they weren't a partner on the program. In terms of implementation, again, I think it's important that all parties gain something from the interaction. You should also have a good sight on, potentially what can go wrong. They should be built into the application from the outset. Maintain that good connection with your project officer. If there are issues, be clear and talk with your project officer, circumvent them. I've had partners leaving. I've had people unfortunately dying during a program, a PI. Anything that can happen. So you just have to be prepared for it. And that's part of the learning curve, I guess. You need to keep a tight rein on finances, understand the rules. In terms of, for example, one of the classic ones is you only get money for equipment based on depreciation. So if your grant is 2 years in duration, but your depreciation cycle is 5 years, you'll only get 2/5 of the money. Hire a good project manager. That's critical, especially if you're leading a program. Some words of advice more specifically about science and technology. You should have clearly described state of the art, robustly built up, with clear emphasis on the novelty and need for the program. It's preferable that you have the central major themes in which multiple parties can feed into. A bit like what I had with the Rather program. We had, for example, multi-pronged discovery approach, something that brings people together. Now that's different, for example, with an ITN. ITNs classically are more distributed. Maybe Lorraine could comment on that maybe later. Incorporate risks and alternative strategies into your work package. Emphasize translational elements. Clearly delineate tasks. In terms of implementation and management, really think about your best possible management team. Emphasize prior experience, particularly at an international level. Now it's difficult if you don't have the experience. How do you get the first hook on the ladder? And I gave you an example of how you might do that, where you partner with someone more senior who has that experience. And this is where I would suggest something like an administrative coordinator, scientific coordinator role, particularly if the person is more junior. I think it's very important that you clarify and detail respective duties and responsibilities. You let people know what their jobs are, and also incorporate business plan elements with strong go, no-go decisions. Also, in terms of your decision-making process, it must be transparent and workable. You must have conflict resolution pathways identified. It's very important to have a strong scientific advisory board. You can lean on that SAB when you need to for difficult times, either with partners or, for example, with discussions with your project officer. And maybe if you have a more commercially focused program, a commercialization board. I think for larger programs, you need to have your own project manager in-house. I'm not a big believer of external project management. That's my own personal bias. And also, if you have a data-rich project, you might consider database management. And again, if you're asking for partner profiles, ask them to clearly define relevant contributions, facilities, and experience. And it's critical when you're describing the consortium as a whole, important to emphasize the added value of people coming together. The whole idea is, collectively we're better than the individual parts. How we might do that is actually have a summary table where you can describe the complementary nature. So you can have a matrix of skills and a partner and indicate that we have good coverage. Comment on interactions with other stakeholders, try and think outside the academic box, interactions with other stakeholders like pharmaceutical industry, regulatory bodies. And also important to organize training and outreach activities. In terms of impact, it's important that you have this multi-layered impact description. For example, if it's a health program, the starting point obviously is a clinical context. You need to define the clinical need, why it's underserved, how your solution is going to address that clinical need. Also, how you're going to actually if the call text, you need to really look carefully at the call text and map your program versus that call text. And then delineate the different impact levels, as I indicated. Also, if you've got SMEs there, it's important that you talk about the impact on the SMEs in terms of diversification, product range. Again, an example is give a new product a name. Talk about the impact on trainees. Why are we doing this at a European level? Can it be done at a national level? You should also take into account national and international research programs. And I'll talk about a national program that we're pushing forward with at the moment at an all-island level and at the end. And the last thing is you should have a detailed communications and dissemination strategy. So again, I won't list it here, but this is very important that you have this outreach aspect. This is an example. We could also have a commercialization pathway where you're bringing forward the technology and delineate that. And so some final words just before I go to the final conclusion. It's important that you don't compromise on the quality of the message. You should really carefully dissect each sentence from start to finish. Each sentence should bring added value, clarity, and perspective. So robust editing is critical. It should be based on evidence not only for science and technology, but in your impact section and also management. You should pull out specifics, pull out the information from your partners, the nuggets of information that will add value. Visuals are very important. You need someone who is actually, if you have a project manager that's good at kind of creating visual hooks, that's critical. Put in some data, intersperse the program with real data. Readability is key. And also think outside your own box. If you're coming primarily from an academic arena, pass on the documents to someone outside your comfort zone and get them to read it. And I don't really have time to cover this, but again, this is just a picture of Annette Byrne. Again, there are loads of really fantastic people in the Irish landscape who have availed of very significant funding under the EU system in the cancer space. And again, I would point to Annette. Annette is really has vast experience in this area, and pulling together a kind of a list of, I'll probably provide it afterwards, which is a kind of a list of specific programs which have been coordinated by partners within Ireland, and I can provide that later once I've finished it. And again, Joachim Prenn, also in the College of Surgeons, led this particular program which I was involved with at Budaside. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to kind of just, I suppose, stand back a bit and talk about, I suppose, the EU cancer missions. I think it was mentioned by Claire. And I think what's interesting is if you look at, there is a kind of outline document which has been released earlier on this year, which kind of maps out generally the areas that the EU Cancer Mission are going to cover. And I'll cover that in the next slide. But it's important, actually, I might cover it now and come back to this slide. So the EU Cancer Missions, it's clear roughly what the areas are going to be. It's clear that it's going to be on the areas on the right-hand side. There's going to be still some areas of trying to understand cancer better, a big focus on prevention, screening. The area of precision medicine is going to be important, but also there's this concept of comprehensive cancer infrastructures. So the discussion has actually moved beyond cancer centers to really infrastructures and networks that are broader than single institutions. And I think it's important in an Irish context that we come together to really allow us to be able to actually be at that table. So again, I would encourage people to look at the interim report that was released earlier on this year. It kind of identifies roughly the areas that are going to be focused on the EU Cancer Mission. Unfortunately, the specific calls have not come out. Hopefully they'll come out sometime in the near future. But roughly, I suppose the idea that we know roughly where these areas are going to be addressed, I think you should develop your networks now in the anticipation that there's going to be calls in that area. Just to finish off, this is a project which I'm working very closely with my colleagues in Queen's University Belfast and other colleagues around Ireland. And this is really, I suppose, try to come up with a new model of carrying out research across an all-island level, such that we can actually create a critical mass in cancer research that allows us to be competitive for things like the CANFOR infrastructure program. And I suppose what we're proposing is a virtual institute with linked facilities in Ireland and Northern Ireland, which would be focused primarily on a data-driven knowledge cluster, but also provide an opportunity for us to interact at a local level with a variety of different stakeholders in academia, industry, with patients, also with the health services. And a particular focus of this program will be on the intersect between cancer and other comorbidities, particularly obesity. So we're hoping to do to talk about this particular program in more detail in the coming weeks. But again, if you're interested, please make contact with me and I can tell you a bit about that program. The last thing I want to indicate is I'm fortunate, again, as I mentioned, to be part of the Cancer Biology and Therapeutics Lab. And which are kind of indicated here. We recently got lab jerseys, which are sported. I can't actually find mine today. I was going to wear it. So again, I'm happy to take any questions now. That's the end of that. I can stop sharing, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Liam, for a really comprehensive and insightful talk. I think it's a great representation of the journey that's required to get involved in coordinating EU grants, so thanks so much. So we have a few minutes for questions. So just a reminder that we have the chat function there at the end of the panel. So if you have any questions, just type them into the chat and make sure you type to everybody so everyone can see them. So I suppose just to kick off the questions, Liam, I just have a question in terms of bringing it back. So you mentioned that, like, in order to, for anyone who hasn't ever really experienced EU funding or EU grants before, that, you know, becoming a partner first instance prior to becoming a coordinator is really important. And I suppose, how would you recommend for somebody to go about trying to get involved in a partner? Is it a case of, you know, you just reach out to your networks and put yourself forward and saying that's something you're interested in, or would you recommend any particular strategies?
There's a couple of strategies. One that I haven't used before, but I think Lorraine would have used it, is participate in cost actions. So there are a variety of different cost actions. Some of those are mapped onto the cancer space. So for example, I'm participating now at the moment in a cost action in invasive lobular cancer, which is a spin out, I suppose, from the RADA program. It's coordinated from a group in Utrecht. And I suppose the aspiration behind that cost action is to use that as a mechanism to bid for large scale funding, EU funding down the track. It could be like an ITN or some other program. So cost actions can be quite useful for like the ITN type of process, where you have people that are generally in the space, they kind of want to work. I know, for example, I think Lorraine led one on exosomes, and traditionally it provides an opportunity for people to meet. Now, obviously, it's difficult to do it at the moment physically, but they still meet virtually. And the idea is it provides an opportunity then to kind of like share your kind of research, people from different kind of geographical backgrounds. And then out of that, you can potentially spin out an ITN or some other kind of network as a partner. And it's a kind of, it's a good way of participating. And I think the idea is that it's a pretty easy process to participate in those programs. So the idea is you can search, I can't remember who the contact point is for that program, but if you look at EI, the contact point for the cost actions, you can search for those in the cancer space. The way I suppose I've done it is I kind of built up a kind of smaller network. I knew people in the cancer research space in Europe, and I kind of interact with them. Also, you know, if there's certain people that you kind of admire in a cancer research setting, I think there's no harm in kind of touching base with them and kind of saying, you know, this is my expertise base. I have something to contribute. It's kind of thing that happens also at meetings, if you know what I mean. So when you go to a meeting, you know, often there's side discussions about, you know, potentially bidding for programs. But there's different ways of doing it. I think the idea is really developing that network. And it's kind of commonly some people that you've kind of forgotten about. It could be people that have been in your background for 10 years ago that you met at a meeting, or you knew from some other context. So, you know, there's great value in a network, and you never know when you will utilize it. So that's really the advice I would have anyway, is nourish the network.
Thanks, Liam. We have a question in here from Chris. Thanks, Liam, really interesting talk. I particularly enjoyed the suggestion that our network should be cross-disciplinary. How do you think we can link these disciplines up better, as they tend to keep to their silos? So again, this is really important in the new cancer mission, focusing on the entire cancer continuum. So, you know, encouraging, trying to get social, nursing and allied health professionals involved in the networks as well. So be interesting on your take there, Liam.
I think you have to work at it. So you have to actually, you know, again, that's something that you can use. I forgot to mention that, say, for example, if you want to coordinate a program, Enterprise Ireland has a pot of money where you can actually bid for, and generally you have a high success rate for availing of that funding. It used to be quite high. I don't know if it's around 12,500 now at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that can facilitate, for example, workshops. Again, I availed of funding under my SFI PI grant for this Horizon program, 25,000. And that facilitated an opportunity where you could have a workshop. And it's important when you design that workshop that you don't just always have the same people you normally talk to. It's important that you bring in those other elements. But also the challenge there is that those other stakeholders have a different language. So for example, we did that in UCD in the aging space. We organized a series of programs on debating aging. We had contributors from humanities, from the health space, from all different kind of stakeholders. And people talk different languages. They also have different drives. So for example, from a humanities point of view, it's not the individual papers generally, it's people working towards monographs. So the actual metrics people use are different. If you're talking to people from a physics background, you have a different way of communicating the research and a different kind of authorship structure. So how we evaluate and interpret that research is different than how we communicate it. So I think the idea is you have to actually work at it by actually assembling the people, and also you have to avoid tokenism as well. So one of the dangers in the cancer space is, oh, I need some patient input. So in the last week, I'll ask the local patient advocacy organization for a letter of support or some contribution. I would frown significantly on that. And ultimately, you need to, at an early stage, if you're really truly talking about a co-design or co-input, you participate at an equal footing from the outset. And then one of our programs that I think Claire was involved with was back in the day, Dynamic Net.
Yes.
We did have.
Remember it well.
I tried to blank out all of our failures, and but we learned a lot from that one. I think Europa Donna was involved in that one. I can't remember. So Europa Donna, and again, the problem with the challenge for Europa Donna, they're not used to actually handling research funding and research finances. They're a voluntary organization where people are coming in. They're not like us who are kind of geared on from the outset. We have a system for handling research money and kind of aspects. And it's difficult sometimes for us to consider that. And we kind of expect, or at least people have expected, individuals to just volunteer their time for nothing. Do you know what I mean? And expect them to contribute. And ultimately, I suppose that's where you really need to think from the other side. Where are they coming from? If it's a patient group, is it a clinic? Is it a company? What's in it for them? What's their drive? Why would they get involved? And that's part of it. You need to actually put that down on paper. So you need to describe what is it for both parties. And then once you do that, it makes sense to the reader. The reader says, oh yeah, I kind of see why these people are involved. So you have to have respect for people as well. So the idea is that it takes time and effort to do it.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks, Liam. I suppose I was delighted to see that you mentioned the All Ireland Institute for Cancer Research that you were looking to establish. And I suppose on that, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on the $1 million question of how you think Brexit will influence cancer researchers in Ireland in relation to Horizon Europe. I guess, from my background, a lot of partnerships that I would have had in Ireland would have been with UK partners, and I guess I'm just a bit concerned that that will therefore have an impact on us applying for Horizon Europe when traditionally our partners might be in the UK.
Yeah, I had specific examples of that a couple of years back where I wanted some of our best partners are in the UK, and I wanted to put in an EU grant, and I needed a specific EU partner, but they didn't know where they stood, and so even 2-3 years ago, I had a negative impact on my ability to actually organize a program. And it's disappointing that we don't know where we are in terms of Brexit. The hope is that they would participate in the programs. I suppose the benefit of something like an All Ireland Cancer Research Institute, there is a potential for joint appointments between, in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And that's maybe one opportunity area. We're hoping to, look at that different mechanisms where we can actually see that.
And Lorraine asked in relation to the All Ireland Institute, is there any thoughts on the funding support for the Institute?
Yeah, so I suppose thankfully Biden is in. So again, people remember 2 years ago, Joe Biden obviously was a key figure behind the cancer moonshot. He came over. I suppose there is a historical context in terms of the All Ireland Cancer Consortium, which was an NCI-driven initiative established, 1999. and which was a kind of partnership between the US NCI and I suppose cancer researchers in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I suppose we're coming to like there was a very nice paper from Mark Lawler in the European Journal of Cancer earlier on this year, which mapped out really what has happened over the last 20 years in cancer research in Ireland. And one of the things that he pointed out in that program was the Precision Oncology Ireland, this program that I've been fortunate to be the deputy director of, which potentially is a stepping stone to an All Ireland Cancer Research Institute. And ultimately, I suppose the opportunity is now, in terms of funding source, it would be a combination of funding. I think one of the catalysts would be, I think, significant philanthropic support, I think, would be important, and we would hope to avail of that because of the All Ireland dimension. We've shown within Precision Oncology Ireland an ability to leverage funding from our national funders. So, for example, Precision Oncology Ireland has 6 cancer charities coming together, including the Irish Cancer Society. That's unprecedented. It has never happened before, where 6 cancer charities have come together. And also we have 8 companies. So again, there's a kind of model there. And obviously you've got other agencies that can contribute.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. We actually have Lorraine O'Driscoll. She said that she'd come on just for a minute and talk about her experience with ITN. So Lorraine, I don't know if you're there. You can turn your camera on.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Lorraine. So obviously, Liam would have indicated during his talk your experience with ITN. So just in the last few minutes, it would be great if you wouldn't mind just kind of imparting some experience. And for anyone else, if you have any final questions for Liam, we have a couple of minutes, just put them in the chat.
Yeah, so as Liam mentioned, I lead an ITN, and that started from leading a cost action in the first place. I'm very interested in extracellular vesicles. It's just a thing that contributes in many ways to cancer. Way back then, we were told that if you want to try and sway a Horizon call, you can get keywords introduced, and we tried a few attempts at that to get these entered onto that, but that wasn't possible. And then we were told afterwards that, typically speaking, small countries don't have that much sway anyway. So the way I went to a talk, I heard of cost actions for the first time, and I thought I would write one. You have to have 10 countries involved in those, and then very quickly it expanded to 28 countries. Now, what cost actions don't fund is research, but it did fund a lot of workshop, a lot of training, secondments, etc., students going from one place to the other. So it meant we were able to do a lot of research, and like it resulted in, say, a Nature Methods paper and a clinical trial and a few things, but it was from other grants we were working on. But from that, I was able to pick academic people, industry, and a few clinical people who I thought worked best together. So that was the basis of the ITN. That's how I identified the right people for it. And so that supports 15 PhD students that are in those various different locations throughout Europe. And again, unfortunately, with these, the score needs to be about the 97% cut off. But the good thing about them is they're a bottom-up approach. So if you feel this is what I'd like an ITN on, you can write an ITN. It's not driven by what the Commission wants an ITN on. Now, unfortunately, my understanding is for the next round for Horizon Europe, there's a cutback on the funding available for ITN. So you can't apply for 15 PhD students anymore, but you can only apply for up to 10, I think. But again, and I'm echoing some of the things that Liam has said, a good project manager with a scientific background has been very important for that as well. So that has also, being involved in that has also got me involved in other European program grants as well, like with the Fraunhofer and various other people who then invite you in to be the vesicle expert in their projects as well. So whether you start with an ITN or start with a big program or start with a cost action and go through the pathway, depending on what your interests are, I think it's certainly very, very, very important and very relevant to try to get involved. And again, I'm saying what Liam's already told you, so I'm not going to take up any more time. Get on panels, get review, and you'll understand how these things work and how people will, they've never heard of somebody before, but they will fight to the bitter end to get the grant that they believe should be funded. So, it's interesting to see how these things go and to be involved. The great thing about ITNs are as well is they allow for students to go on secondment. So students from my lab have gone to 2 different industry settings and secondments. So that's actually got their foot in the doorway for employment opportunities as well. Various workshops that we've organised. The students now are going to be organising a conference themselves in Paris next year, hopefully, if COVID allows. Joint patents and papers, and they've had a lot of opportunity as well of meeting and working with patient groups. So I do think that they're you know, hard work to get funded, but they're a lot of fun and very good when they're going.
Great, thanks so much, Elaine. And Liam just has a comment there. Marie Curie co-fund also a good model, and Marie Curie Rise also an option. It's a bit challenging to run. So thanks for that, Liam, and thanks a mil, Lorraine. Just we've got a final question for Liam. So from Rachel, it is clear that there is a very high standard for funding. For example, need to score 15 out of 15 for an application. What is the difference between a very good application and an excellent application? Is there an X factor that makes an application excellent and stand out?
So I always want to be Simon Cowell, but my pants isn't high enough. But, it's a difficult one. I think the idea is that, I'll give you an example of our most recent proposal, which you know, unfortunately we didn't get. We got 14.5 out of 15, which is, you know, you think you get funding at 14.5 out of 15, but you know, no, even there's some cases where even if you get 15 out of 15, you're still not funded. So a perfect score sometimes is still not funded. And so it does come down to some other factors. And for example, one of the areas would be real true involvement from the SME sector. You know, what you find with a lot of academic grants, there's kind of token involvement of the SME sector. There's not real engagement. There's no real kind of participation in the program, or it's very minimal. So I think if you can really deepen those roots and make it concrete, so different stakeholder participation, and if you have a richer program, that's one thing I think is critical. And also, I think clarity is it. You know, that I think that excitement piece, you really have to have that energy going throughout the piece. So I think if you can kind of maintain that and enthuse the reviewer, as Lorraine indicated, you need to have someone that will stand up in a room and say, "This is brilliant." Okay. And it's hard sometimes for people who are reserved in the scientific sphere. So you need to kind of pass on that excitement to the evaluator.
Brilliant, thanks, Liam. So look, we can spend all day here, but we might just finish up because we're a little bit over time. So thanks so much, Liam, for your time today. It has been a really great session, and thanks, Rachel and Shauna, to be organising everything behind the scenes. There's a couple of extra questions there, but what we might do is if you have any questions that you want to ask Liam after you've gone away and thought about the talk, you can just ask them at research@irishcancer.ie, and we can try to answer them for you. And just a reminder that we are planning more of these engagement events over the next year as Horizon Europe launches. So if you do have any particular Horizon Europe topic that you would like us to cover, just again get in touch at research@irishcancer.ie, and we'll do our very best to accommodate. And again, just to finish by thanking Liam, it was a really, really great talk. Thank you, everyone.
See you then. Take care. Bye.
Bye.